What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China, military, economic, geopolitical, etc. If that's something that you might be interested in, maybe consider subscribing. Everyone else, welcome back, guys. I'm glad you guys enjoyed the last video. This is going to be a little longer than usual. I've already had to cut some stuff out. This was about 15 pages, but there's so much going on that I just thought we had to talk about some of the stuff. 3 comments below. If you enjoyed the video, smash the like button. It's massive help. Honestly guys, huge help smashing the like button. And my Patreon details are below for those who want to go the extra mile. But with all that said and done, let's just jump into this week's a little longer than usual China update. This week, the People's Republic of China celebrated the 70th anniversary of the PRC entering the Korean War. In the mainland, in the PRC, it's not known as the Korean War, but rather the, quote, war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, end quote. There have been massive celebrations in Beijing and a lot of state media attention. Chinese and foreign specialists have pointed out that in previous decades in the past, the scale of the Korean War commemoration events in China is typically linked to the state of the China-US relationship at the time. With the China-US relationship at its worst point in decades, the timing of the anniversary has made it particularly politically powerful domestically. On Monday, the state-run Global Times wrote, quote, China's commemoration of the war this year sends a clear message. If the US insists on its hegemonic ways and keeps dragging China into confrontation, China will fight back unswervingly, just like 70 years ago. End quote. The editor-in-chief of the publication, Xinjiang, took to Twitter later that day with, quote, today marks the 70th anniversary of the Chinese People's Volunteers entering DPRK to fight the Korean War. The largest spiritual legacy of that war to Chinese people is, we could defeat the US when we were very poor. Is there any reason for us to be afraid of it today? On Wednesday, the state-run People's Liberation Daily released a long commentary, published a long commentary. Trust me, it was very long. It took me ages to read it, discussing the last time China and the US went to war and the lessons for the current political conflict between the two giants. Quote, from the day it stood up, the Chinese nation, here using the political construct of 中华民族, has never succumbed to any powerful forces. Today, socialist China stands tall in the east of the world. How can it be frightened by the unreasonable pressure and blackmail of hegemonism? How can the Chinese people today bow their heads in the face of the brutal bullying of power politics? End quote. On Friday, 3 feature films and 1 documentary commemorating the Korean War were released, including an animated film called Salute to the Heroes, which follows the stories of 5 PLA soldiers who gave their lives during the conflict, and according to state-run Global Times, quote, seeks to introduce the stories of 5 heroic Chinese soldiers during the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, 1950 through 53, also known as the Korean War, to teens through a medium which they favor, animation, end quote. Now for an incredibly oversimplified history. After the surrender of the Empire of Japan at the end of World War II in August 1945, what we think of as Korea today, or the Koreas today, was divided at the 38th parallel into 2 zones of occupation. The Soviets administrated the northern half and the Americans the southern half. Both sides set up governments soon after. Korea, like the island of Taiwan, had been an imperial holding of the Empire of Japan since the 1890s. Actually, it's more complicated than that, but we really don't have time to get into that here. But for our purposes, we can just say that. Before that, Korea had been an imperial holding-ish, sort of the large multi-ethnic, Manchu-ruled Qing Empire. The same Qing Empire that ruled over China and the Chinese. Though most Chinese today, if not most Chinese today, would likely claim, 1, that the Qing Empire was China, just ruled by an ethnic minority. 2, the peoples conquered by the Qing Empire, who are now part of the modern People's Republic of China state, are all members of the Chinese nation, 中华民族. And 3, in the 19th century, that the Qing Empire, China, was the victim of Western, Russian, and Japanese imperialism only, rather than a centuries-old imperial and colonial power itself, which ran into stronger empires, much like the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires at the time. I would argue that all three of these claims are deeply ahistoric, but again, this is very complex and we definitely do not have the time to get into that here. Anyway, my point, whether it is the Mongols or the Manchus or the Chinese ruling from Beijing, they all recognize the geopolitical importance of the Korean Peninsula as much as the Japanese do, and later the Soviets and Americans do too. The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, when, with the blessing of Stalin and Mao, though this is disputed by historians, North Korea invaded South Korea. In the first few months, the South was pushed back to Busan in the southeast. In September 1950, at Incheon near Seoul, an amphibious UN counteroffensive led by the United States was successful and began pushing north. UN forces moved into North Korea in October, rapidly pushing north. On the 19th of October, People's Republic of China forces crossed the Yalu, or the Amnok River, separating the PRC and North Korea, and entered the war. As an interesting side, by the way, entomologists speculate that the Mandarin name for the river, Yalu, which literally means duck green river, is just a phonetic rendering of the older Manchu word, which means literally the boundary which separates the two countries. Anyway, back to the war. After years of stalemate and over 3 million dead, the parties involved decided to end the fighting in July 1953, basically cutting the peninsula along the same place it had been when the fighting began. What we have today is the legacy of that arrangement. South Korea is South Korea, a thriving, wealthy, and free democratic republic, and North Korea is, well, North Korea. Both sides remain heavily militarized and dependent on external security, and in the case of the North, economic guarantors. I've been to South Korea 11 times over the last 4 years. It's an incredible country. I'd highly recommend visiting. I think it's a very underrated country. Everyone who's in East Asia should definitely check out Seoul. I've tried on 2 occasions to visit North Korea. Both times I experienced difficulties and I had to cancel. But when I lived in Beijing, I enjoyed cordial relationships with several North Koreans. They were always very respectful in their interactions with me and seemed very proud of their country. As the children of elites, they were, of course, huge beneficiaries of their country's system. The Korean Peninsula situation remains a serious geopolitical flashpoint in Asia, particularly in East Asia, and security challenge for many nations, large and small, in the 21st century. So with all that said, it's worth asking this week, as China celebrates the 70th anniversary of it entering the war, according to Beijing, what is the official position on China's role in that war then and its legacy today, particularly vis-a-vis North Korea? Quote, 70 years ago, in order to defend peace and resist aggression, the Chinese Communist Party and government resolutely made the historic decision to resist the United States and assist the DPRK and defend our country. The heroic Chinese people's volunteers, holding high the banner of justice, together with the Korean people and army, sacrificed their lives and fought with blood, winning the great victory of the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, and making great contributions to the cause of world peace and to the progress of mankind. The victory of that war is a victory of justice, a victory of peace, and a victory for the people. End quote. For the third time this year, the United States State Department has designated a new set of People's Republic of China media outlets as foreign missions. This is another step in the media journalist tit-for-tat between China and the United States, which began all the way back in late January, early February this year, when the virus situation in Wuhan was blowing up and the People's Republic of China expelled several US journalists working for the Wall Street Journal. At the time, Beijing claimed that the reason for the expulsion was because the Wall Street Journal had published an article highly offensive to China. We covered this actually when it happened, and we've been following this tit for tat throughout the year. Let's look at the latest development with a statement from the US Department of State. Quote, pursuant to the authorities under the Foreign Missions Act, the State Department is issuing today a new determination that designates the US operations of, then lists out the different Chinese entities there, as foreign missions. These 6 entities all meet the definition of a foreign mission under the Foreign Missions Act in that they are, quote, substantially owned or effectively controlled, end quote, by a foreign government. In this case, they are effectively controlled by the government of the People's Republic of China. The decision to designate these entities does not place any restrictions on what these organizations may publish in the United States. It simply recognizes them for what they are: People's Republic of China controlled propaganda outlets, end quote. And the Chinese reaction, quote, China will make legitimate, necessary reactions. China urges the United States to immediately change course, correct mistakes, and stop the political oppression and senseless restrictions against Chinese media outlets, end quote. And though not an official statement, this is from an individual who is quite influential within the People's Republic of China. I'm quoting his English language tweet here verbatim. I haven't corrected the English. Quote, the US has gone too far. The move will further poison working environment of media outlets in each other's country. As long as Chinese media outlets suffer actual harm, Beijing will definitely retaliate, and US media outlets' operation in Hong Kong could be included in retaliation list, end quote. The Taiwan Election and Democratization Study Project of Taiwan's publicly funded National Zhengzhi University completed a survey of approximately 1,700 adults earlier this year and published their findings recently. Taiwan's global direction and views on independence and unification were the focus of this survey. Let's look at the survey results. First up, we have this one here. Which direction should Taiwan's relations with blank move into the future? In the blue you have the United States, in red you have China. 5 is absolutely yes, -5 is absolutely no for either of these options, or agreeing with either of these options. So we can see overall on net there is a more favorable position for Taiwan's relations to move towards the US in the future, with a slight net negative view of moving towards China. But we can see, if we look to the other two, the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Democratic Progressive Party, the party of Taiwan, the current ruling party, we can see that there is quite a difference when it comes to party affiliation. With the KMT there is a preference towards China, but there is a net positive view on both counts. People who vote KMT on net balance want a closer relationship with China, but want a closer relationship with both countries on balance. But if we look at the DPP, there is a big difference. Overwhelming support for moving towards the United States, and not overwhelmingly against China, but not particularly positive either. Almost at negative 1.6 there. Let's look at the next one, which I think this next one is very interesting and very telling. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Support for independence or unification under 4 conditions in percentages. Now I'm going to go through and break down what each of these conditions are, but this basically looks at the percentage of respondents who supported or highly supported, in favor or highly in favor of a particular situation. So we'll go through them one by one. The first is independence peace, and this is Taiwan becomes an independent country and there's no war. There's guaranteed peace. There's no war whatsoever. You have a peaceful relationship in the region. You see 67% overall in favor of that direction. The Kuomintang, the KMT, you can see that it's about 50%, just under 50%, and the DPP, very overwhelming there, over 80%. The second condition is independence, even if that means attack and war. So do you support independence even if you know it is likely going to cause war or an attack, a military attack on Taiwan? This is very interesting. Overall, the country is split. Almost 50% of those surveyed support or highly support or in great favor of supporting an independent Taiwan, even if it meant war. The KMT, that's only 1/4, and the DPP about 70%. Very interesting, that one. So even in the case of war, you've got it broken down the middle according to this polling data at least. Third one, you see unification, some conditions. Now, the some conditions here is that the political, and this was the wording that was used when they surveyed these people, the political, social, and economic environment in the mainland is very similar to that in Taiwan. That's basically saying that Taiwan and the mainland would have very similar levels of economic and political freedom, and that the societies would be more or less similar. Under those conditions, would you support unification with the mainland? Under those conditions, you only see 30% that support unification, lower than both the independence under the peace and attack conditions, 30%. And of course there's a split between the parties there. Then the final unification, different conditions. This is basically unification today. Unification, but the political, social, and economic conditions in Taiwan and the mainland are different as they are today. Would you support unification? Overall, 11%. Overall, 11%. And you have about a quarter of those in the KMT that would support that. But overall for the country, 11%. So what conclusions can we make when we look at this data? Well, we can make a few conclusions. I've jotted them down here. One, questions of identity and global direction are somewhat divided along party lines in Taiwan, with a net preference to move closer to the United States in the future. Two, independence is far more desirable than unification with the mainland, but Taiwanese are cut down the middle when it comes to whether independence is worth it if the result is war, which it would likely be at this point if they declared independence. It would probably mean war. This suggests a pragmatic maintenance of the current status quo as the preferable option. And three, for our purposes here, the mainland narrative that people in Taiwan desire unification and that it is only a small group of separatists that are causing issues in the cross-strait relationship is a political fiction, which will be increasingly difficult to maintain, putting pressure on Beijing policymakers. Now, while we are on Taiwan, we should probably touch on a few more things like these weapon sales this week. On Thursday, the US State Department approved $2 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, including 400 land-based anti-ship missiles and cruise missile stations. Quote, "We have no intention to have an arms race with the Chinese Communist forces, and our arms purchases are made in line with our combat operation needs and the latest situation, as well as strategic considerations." And the reaction from the mainland, quote, "The Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, authority in Taiwan will severely undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and bring grave suffering to people in Taiwan through its arms purchases from the United States in its attempts to counter military force to resist reunification and seek Taiwan independence." End quote. I believe we are entering a new period when China engages in a massive semiconductor chip development and production race with the United States and others with the same degree of strategic importance placed on it as the space race or atomic weapons project in the past. In this race, China is quite far behind currently, but despite warnings from industry experts that say you can't just throw money at these things and see success, Beijing is nonetheless allocating massive levels of resources to developing an advanced homegrown semiconductor industry. This, however, has resulted in problems of its own. Huge government subsidies to the industry has attracted many new entrants, resulting in massive waste and resource misallocation, something the National Development and Reform Commission in Beijing has criticized as quote-unquote chaotic and is now seeking to curb through greater oversight and regulation. A spokesperson for the National Development and Reform Commission told reporters this week that some businesses with, quote, insufficient knowledge of integrated circuit development have blindly entered into projects, end quote. There have been many media and think tank reports over the last few months. I've read at least 7 or 8 of these about incompetent and opportunistic companies entering the industry to enjoy the generous government support and subsidies. Some companies already wasting billions of US dollars in resources. According to the mainland-based China DataPay, nearly 10,000 1,000 companies shift from their original industry to the chip sector in the first 8 months of the year. The risks of low-level construction have appeared repeatedly, and there has even been stalled construction of individual projects and vacant factories, resulting in a waste of resources. End quote. At a special meeting on Tuesday, the National Development and Reform Commission announced new policies to better regulate its exploding chip manufacturing and development sector. Private Chinese media company Caixin reports that these new policies include, quote, holding the heads of projects accountable, encouraging companies and financial institutes that invest in them to take greater responsibility, and strengthening supervision and guidance on essential integrated circuit projects. Even if China's efforts to build a homegrown chip sector are successful, there is the question of how much this is all going to cost. Quote, I have no idea whether or not this all-nation effort will eventually be successful. But even if it is, until the project begins to produce more value than it costs, it will absorb an enormous net amount of real resources, perhaps 1 to 2% of GDP for the next 7 years. End quote. For those of you who are interested in the geopolitics of semiconductors, which I'm sure you are, I'm super into it, and I think it is very important. We don't have too much time to go into it here. It's beyond the scope of this episode or really this channel, but I have a link to a recent Eurasia Group paper on this topic in the description below. So if you're interested in the geopolitics of semiconductors, check that out. Revisions have been made to China's national defense law, which, among other things, legislate the conditions by which the People's Republic of China could and should mobilize its forces for war. This revision expands the scope of what the People's Liberation Army would be mobilized over to include threats to, quote, 发展利益, or development interests. Quote, when the sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, security, and development interests of the People's Republic of China are threatened, the state, in accordance with the constitution and laws, will carry out a general or partial mobilization. End quote. As far as I can tell, there doesn't appear to be much guidance as to what development interests actually are. General of the PLA, Wei Fenghe, explained why the national defense law required revisions in an interview with state media this week. He explained, quote, China is in an important period of strategic opportunity for development, facing more diversified and complex security threats and challenges, putting forward new and higher requirements for the overall enhancement of national defense capabilities, and there is an urgent need to make corresponding adjustments to the defense policy system to provide a legal basis for building a strong and consolidated modern national defense and effectively safeguarding national sovereignty, security, and development interests. End quote. This week, English and Arabic language versions of state-run media outlets in the mainland have been producing a lot of content about a government report published by the mainland-based Xinjiang Development Research Center. This looks to be part of a big international PR effort by the PRC government to respond to increasing global attention on the grave situation in Xinjiang. It's worth spending a few minutes looking at this narrative and this report from the government and see what the government wishes to push, what sort of narrative the government here wishes to push for an international audience. Quote, through comprehensive analysis, the team has concluded that the government at all levels and the relevant enterprises in Xinjiang and other provinces or cities have actively helped Xinjiang's ethnic minority groups find jobs and fully safeguarded their basic rights, such as the labor right and the right to development. End quote. As for the international allegations of mass detentions, forced labor, and forced sterilization, which could constitute genocide in Xinjiang, the report stated, quote, the claim is a slanderous lie with a political purpose that exposes the real faces of think tanks as lackeys of the United States and the West in their anti-China plots. End quote. State-run China Daily published an English article entitled, quote, no forced labor in Xinjiang report finds, end quote, and begins with, quote, investigation says claims have been fabricated by Western think tanks for political purposes, end quote. And later in the article, quote, Some claims by Western think tanks of the use of forced labor in Xinjiang are false, and their arguments are baseless and unscientific, end quote. The links to some of these English language articles are included in the description below if you want to see the original articles in English. The Xinjiang Development Research Center was also responsible for a documentary released in late August entitled, quote, Lies and Truth, Vocational Education and Training in Xinjiang, end quote, which China Daily, again in English, reported, quote, nails West's lies on Xinjiang fight against terrorism, end quote. The Foreign Ministry is also working with state media in this current narrative push by the PRC government. On Tuesday, responding to a question from state-run CCTV about US criticism regarding the situation in Xinjiang, spokesman Zhao Lijian said, quote, Pompeo is proud of lying, cheating and stealing. He has been the source of various disinformation on China. So-called forced labor and other issues are typical cases of fabrication, end quote. This week, a Canadian parliamentary committee concluded in a report that China's actions against ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang constitute genocide and called on the federal government for sanctions against officials involved in the government's policy. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said the report was, quote, full of lies and disinformation and shows Canada's parliament's, quote, ignorance and prejudice, end quote. Okay guys, that's the report for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to put your comments below, like if you enjoyed the video, and as always, keep safe and keep sane. I will see you all next time on China Update.